In the late summer of 1944, the Pacific Theater was a landscape of predictable, if brutal, patterns. The American war machine had mastered the art of the amphibious assault, moving from island to island with an industrial momentum that seemed unstoppable. The formula was simple: isolate the target, crush it with naval gunfire, and overwhelm the survivors with the sheer weight of Marine Corps grit. But beneath the surface of this confidence, a transformation was occurring in the shadows of the Japanese Imperial Command. The era of the futile Banzai charge was dying, replaced by a much darker, more calculated philosophy of attrition. Nowhere would this shift be more devastating than on a small, lobster-shaped island in the Palau chain known as Peleliu. The tragedy of Peleliu began not with a bullet, but with a profound failure of imagination. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, looked at the maps of the island and saw a quick victory. He famously predicted to his men and the press that the battle would be a short, sharp affair, lasting no more than 3 or 4 days. This hubris was the first domino to fall in a sequence of systemic failures. Rupertus was so convinced of a rapid triumph that he initially refused to allow a dedicated army division to wait in reserve, fearing they might steal the glory from his Marines. He wanted this to be a pure Marine victory, a testament to the elite status of the old breed. But the intelligence reports he relied upon were catastrophically shallow. Aerial reconnaissance had failed to penetrate the dense canopy of the Umurbrogol ridges. The planners saw the airfield and the flat coastal plains, but they missed the labyrinth of 600 interconnected caves that had been carved into the ancient coral heart of the island. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, was not interested in glory or a beautiful death. He had been given a singular grim task: turn Peleliu into a gargantuan sponge that would soak up American blood and time. He had moved away from the water's edge, abandoning the traditional doctrine of stopping the enemy at the beach. Instead, he waited in the dark. On the morning of September 15th, the pre-landing bombardment began. It was a display of naval power that seemed sufficient to crack the world in half. For days, the battleships and cruisers poured thousands of tons of high explosives into the island. From the decks of the transport ships, the Marines watched the island disappear behind a curtain of fire and smoke. Rupertus and his staff believed that nothing could survive such a deluge. They were wrong. The coral of Peleliu was not merely rock. It was a natural fortress. The naval shells designed to explode on contact with hard surfaces barely scratched the deep reinforced bunkers and limestone caverns where Nakagawa's 10,000 men sat in silence, waiting for the barrage to lift. As the first waves of the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches, designated white and orange, the reality of the situation shattered the morning air. The Japanese had not been destroyed. They had been waiting. The moment the ramps dropped, the beaches became a slaughterhouse of interlocking fire. The Marines found themselves trapped on narrow strips of sand. pinned down by heavy artillery and mortar fire coming from the high ground they had been told was suppressed. The systemic failure of the intelligence branch was now being paid for in the currency of young lives. The 3-day battle was already an impossibility, though the command refused to admit it. One of the most harrowing tactical disasters occurred at a location known as the Point. This was a jagged coral promontory that overlooked the northern flank of the landing beaches. It was a natural defensive position that had been reinforced with concrete and steel. From its heights, Japanese machine gunners could rake the entire length of the landing zone. Captain George Hunt and the men of K Company were tasked with taking this position. They did so with a ferocity that defied logic, scaling the jagged cliffs under a hail of grenades. But once they took the summit, they found themselves isolated. For 30 hours, Hunt's men held the point against relentless counterattacks, their numbers dwindling until they were down to a handful of survivors. The irony of the point was that while it was a tactical necessity to silence the guns, its capture did little to alleviate the broader nightmare unfolding inland. The Marines were moving off the beaches and into a landscape that felt alien, even for the Pacific. The heat on Peleliu was an enemy as potent as the Japanese. Temperatures soared to 115 degrees. The island was a baked coral oven that reflected the sun's glare with blinding intensity. To make matters worse, a logistical failure of the highest order had occurred. The water supplies had been transported in drums that previously held oil and gasoline. As the thirsty Marines drank, they were poisoned by the chemical residue, leading to a wave of dysentery and dehydration that crippled entire battalions. As the battle moved into its second week, the 1st Marine Division was being ground into the dust. They had reached the base of the Umurbrogol, a series of ridges that the men would soon rename Bloody Nose Ridge. Here, the war became a primitive, subterranean struggle. The Japanese had perfected the art of the reverse slope defense. When the Marines reached the top of a ridge, they would be fired upon from the next ridge over, or from the very ground beneath their feet. The caves were designed so that the mouths were protected by heavy steel doors, and the tunnels were interconnected to allow the defenders to move unseen. It was a war of flamethrowers and satchel charges. The Marines had to burn and blast their way through every yard of coral. There were no front lines, only a chaotic mosaic of small unit actions where survival was measured in minutes. The systemic refusal of the command to acknowledge the scale of the disaster meant that the 1st Marine Division was being used as a blunt instrument against an unbreakable wall. Among the carnage, unsung heroes emerged. There were the stretcher bearers who ran into the open to retrieve the wounded, often becoming casualties themselves. There were the Navy corpsmen who performed surgeries in the mud and heat, their hands shaking from exhaustion. And there were the riflemen who, despite seeing their entire squads wiped out, continued to crawl forward into the mouths of the caves. By the end of September, the 1st Marine Division was no longer a functional fighting force. The 1st Regiment, under Colonel Louis B. Puller, had suffered over 50% casualties. In some companies, the loss rate was as high as 70%, yet Rupertus continued to insist that they could finish the job without help. Eventually, the reality could no longer be ignored. The 81st Infantry Division of the U.S. Army was brought in to relieve the shattered Marines. The transition was bitter. The Marines felt they were being pulled out before they could finish what they started, while the soldiers of the 81st were horrified by the state of the men they were replacing. The Army brought a different philosophy to the fight. Instead of the high-speed, high-casualty charges favored by the Marines, the 81st used a method they called the corkscrew and blowtorch. They moved slowly, using tanks and massive quantities of explosives to seal the caves one by one, burying the defenders alive. Colonel Nakagawa watched his command slowly disintegrate. He knew the end was coming, but he stayed true to his orders to delay the Americans for as long as possible. He did not order a final Banzai charge. He did not seek a quick exit. He stayed in his command post, deep within the Umurbrogol, directing the defense until the very last moment. In late November, 73 days after the landing, Nakagawa sent his final message to Tokyo. "Our sword is broken, and our spears are gone." He then committed ritual suicide. The organized resistance on Peleliu was over, but the cost was staggering. The American forces had suffered nearly 10,000 casualties to take an island that many would soon argue was strategically worthless. The historical irony of Peleliu is perhaps the most painful part of its legacy. Even as the Marines were dying on the beaches in September, the strategic landscape of the Pacific had changed. Admiral Halsey had suggested that the invasion of the Peleliu be cancelled, as the Japanese air power in the region had already been neutralized. General Douglas MacArthur, however, insisted that the islands were necessary to protect his flank for the upcoming invasion of the Philippines. History has largely sided with Halsey. The airfield on Peleliu, which was the primary objective of the entire operation, was barely used by American bombers. The island was bypassed by the tide of war, leaving the survivors to wonder what they had been fighting for. Peleliu became the forgotten battle. It was overshadowed by the liberation of the Philippines and the later, even larger horrors of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But for the men who were there, it was the ultimate test of the human spirit against a systemic failure of leadership and a landscape designed for death. The philosophical takeaway of this tragedy lies in the collision between old-world military ego and the new reality of total attritional war. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the theater of conflict, the most dangerous weapon is not the gun or the bow, but the stubborn refusal of the command to see the world as it truly is. The ghosts of Peleliu still haunt the Umurbrogol. To this day, the caves remain filled with the rusted remnants of the struggle. Discarded helmets, empty shell casings and the bones of those never found. The island has returned to its quiet, tropical sail, but the coral ridges still bear the scars of the flame and the steel. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the jagged peaks of the Bloody Nose Ridge, we are left to contemplate the silence. It is a silence bought at a price no map or strategic report could ever justify. It is the silence of 10,000 voices, cut short in a struggle that the world chose to forget. We look back not just to honor the courage of those who fought, but to scrutinize the failures that sent them there. We remember the Marines of the old breed and the soldiers of the 81st who endured the unendurable. Their legacy is not found in the strategic value of the airfield or the maps of the High Command. Their legacy is written in the grit and the blood of the coral itself. It is a testament to the fact that even in the face of systemic collapse and tactical madness, the individual human heart can endure. But it is a lesson that should have never been taught in such a crucible of fire. The story of Peleliu remains a dark mirror held up to the face of war, a reflection of what happens when hubris meets a determined enemy in a place where God himself seems to have turned away. The waves continue to lap against the orange and white beaches, washing away the footprints of the past. But the echoes of the Umurbrogol will never truly fade. 3 days of glory, a short and sharp affair. Rupertus smiled and breathed the tropical air. No army backup, no division in reserve, just the old breed's pride and a direct line of nerve. But the aerial eyes were shallow and blind, missing the 600 caves left behind. Kunio Nakagawa sits inside the black, turning the coral heart into a trap. White and orange beaches, the ramps begin to drop, an infant lock and slaughter that the shells could never stop. The drums are water poisoned with oil and gasoline, a modern hell of dysentery that you've never seen. Oh, look into the coral oven burning at the base, 115 degrees in an alien place. Blasted by the flamethrower, crushed by the door, grit against the limestone in a calculated war. Bloody Nose Ridge, where the young men bleed, sacrifice to hubris and a dark strategic greed. Hey. Hold the point for 30 hours, Captain Hunt's elite. Isolated summits in the suffocating heat. Then the Umurbrogol rises, a subterranean maze. Every yard of ridge is a suffocating blaze. The reverse slope defense, steel doors on the cave. Walking on the bodies of the forgotten brave. Puller's first regiment is broken and torn. 70% are gone where they were born.
He's an alien.